Before we begin, this story involves a mass casualty event, including the deaths of children and the destruction of an indigenous community. If that's something you need to step away from, we understand. Take care of yourself first. For 20 minutes, the people of Halifax stood at their windows and watched a burning ship drift into their harbour. Fathers held children on their shoulders for a better view. Factory workers left their stations to line the waterfront. It was the most interesting thing that had happened all week. The ship was carrying 2,925 tons of high explosives. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. This is the Unlit Room. New stories every week. Today, a 20-minute countdown that nobody knew had started. December 6, 1917. Halifax Harbour, Nova Scotia. A deep, narrow channel called the Narrows, connecting the harbour basin to Bedford Basin. On the Richmond side of the waterfront, a dense working-class neighbourhood of wooden houses pressed right up against the docks. And entering the harbour that morning, a French cargo ship called the Mont-Blanc, low in the water, unmarked, carrying the largest shipment of high explosives ever assembled on a single vessel. At 8:45 that morning, two ships met in the Narrows. The Mont-Blanc was inbound, heading for Bedford Basin. The Imo, a Norwegian relief vessel, was outbound, running late, moving too fast for the channel. The rules of the harbour said each ship should keep to the right, like cars on a road. But a series of miscommunications, whistle signals misread, courses not corrected, put them on a collision path. They hit at walking speed, about 1 knot. The kind of impact that, on any other ship, would have been a minor incident. A dented hull, some paperwork, an insurance claim. But the Imo's bow scraped along the Mont Blanc's starboard side, and that scraping tore open the barrels of benzol, a highly flammable industrial solvent, lashed to the deck. The friction struck sparks. The benzol vapors caught fire. Within seconds, the deck of the Mont Blanc was burning. Halifax in 1917 was a city running on wartime energy. The harbour was one of the busiest military staging points in the North Atlantic. Ships came and went constantly. A fire on a vessel in the Narrows was unusual, but it was a spectacle, not a crisis. Not yet. The 41 men aboard the Mont Blanc knew something no one on that waterfront knew. They knew exactly what was in the hold. The crew of the Mont Blanc understood instantly what the fire meant. Their ship was carrying 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of high-octane fuel, and the 300 tons of benzol now burning on deck. They had minutes, maybe, before the fire reached the explosives below. Captain Aimé Lemedec gave the order to abandon ship. All 41 crew members lowered the lifeboats and rowed for the Dartmouth shore as fast as they could. They screamed warnings as they went. But they were French sailors in an English-speaking port. They were shouting in a language almost no one around them understood. And the fire was loud, a roaring column of flame and black smoke rising hundreds of feet into the sky. Even if someone had understood the words, they couldn't have heard them. So the Mont Blanc drifted, unmanned, burning, toward Pier 6 in the heart of the Richmond district. The Richmond neighbourhood was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. Wooden houses with front porches, a school, churches, small shops. The kind of neighbourhood that gets described after the fact as close-knit. The kind of neighbourhood that doesn't exist anymore because in 20 minutes it wouldn't. What happened next lasted less than a second, but it would take the city of Halifax 30 years to recover from it. At 9:04 and 35 seconds on the morning of December 6th, the fire reached the Mont Blanc's cargo. The explosion released an estimated 2.9 kilotons of energy. To put that in perspective, this was the largest human-made explosion in history. It would hold that record for 28 years until the atomic bomb. The pressure wave moved faster than sound. It snapped trees. It bent iron rails into curves. It flattened every structure within 800 meters of the blast. The Mont Blanc, a ship weighing over 3,000 tons, was vaporized. Fragments of its hull rained down across the city for kilometers. A piece of its anchor shaft, weighing over 1,000 pounds, landed 3.5 kilometers away. In the Richmond district, the destruction was total. Entire blocks ceased to exist. The wooden houses, the school, the churches, gone. People who had been standing at their windows watching the fire were killed by the glass that shattered inward at the speed of a bullet. 9,000 people were injured that morning. Hundreds were blinded by flying glass. So many that Halifax became a centre for blindness treatment for decades afterward. 1,782 people were confirmed dead. There's a detail in the aftermath reports that's hard to get past. Among the dead were children whose parents had lifted them up to the windows for a better view of the fire. The thing that killed them was also the last thing their parents ever showed them. But the explosion wasn't the end of it, not even close. The detonation displaced the water in the harbour. A tsunami, a wall of water pushed outward from the blast, surged up the shores on both sides. On the Dartmouth side, it swept into Tufts Cove, where a Micmac community had lived for generations. The wave destroyed the settlement, the people, the homes, the history of that place, erased in a single surge. And then, the next day, December 7th, a blizzard arrived. One of the worst storms of the winter, dumping heavy snow on a city with no roofs, no windows, no walls. Survivors who had crawled out of the rubble were now buried under snow. Rescue crews couldn't reach them. Fires that had broken out across the city burned under the snowfall, trapping people between flame and ice. Here's what makes this story stay with you. The crew of the Mont-Blanc survived. All 41 of them made it to the Dartmouth shore. And in the minutes between the collision and the detonation, they tried. They tried to warn people. Captain Lemedec and his men shouted from their lifeboats, waving their arms, pointing at the ship. But they were French-speaking sailors in an English-speaking harbour. The people on the waterfront couldn't understand what they were saying, and the spectacle of the fire was so dramatic, the column of smoke, the fountain of sparks, that the crowds weren't listening to the tiny figures in the rowboats. They were watching the show. The only people who knew what was about to happen couldn't make themselves understood. And the people running toward the waterfront, toward the fire, toward the windows, lifting their children for a better view, were running toward their deaths. The Halifax explosion killed nearly 2,000 people because of a gap that wasn't technological. It wasn't a failure of engineering or science. It was a failure of communication, a French crew, an English port, and a fire too loud to shout over. The city rebuilt. It took decades, but Halifax came back. Every year on December 6th, the city holds a memorial. And every Christmas, the province of Nova Scotia sends a giant Christmas tree to the city of Boston. A thank you gift, because Boston was the first city to send aid after the explosion. They've been sending that tree for over 100 years now. Some wounds heal into traditions, and some traditions are how a city remembers what it survived. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend, but maybe don't tell them it's all real until after they've finished. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.